Hi everyone. Thanks very much for everyone who's signed up today and come along, especially when it's such a nice day outside. So good to see you all. So yeah, as Evelyn said, we're going to go through some employee incentivisation today. We've got a PowerPoint. Sorry, Jack, I don't see it on the screen. I don't know if you've put it up yet.
No, just give me a shout. Do you want it up just now, Aaron? Yeah.
Yeah, if you could pop that
Okay,
up, that'd be great.
no
Thank you.
problem.
So hopefully everyone can see that okay. So I'm Erin and I'm joined with my colleagues Claire and Joe today. Joe and I work in the entrepreneurial team and Claire works in our employment team. So Jack, if you could just go on to the next slides, we'll just go through a quick agenda. So Claire's going to cover employee incentives, types of employee benefits and flexible and remote working. And then I'll cover a bit on share options, kind of what they are, why they're used and different types of share options. And then we'll reserve some time at the end for a Q&A. But if anyone does have any questions as we're going through, feel free to just pop them in the chat and we can pick them up at the end. So I'll pass over to Claire to get started on employee incentives.
Thanks, Erin. Hi everyone, my name's Claire. As Erin said, I am a solicitor in the employment team at Harper Macleod. So we're going to go through a few ideas of employee incentives and what benefits that can bring to you and your business if your employees are incentivised well. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Jack. The first question you might have is, what are employee incentives? And to an extent, it's quite an obvious answer. So employee incentives or benefits are things that incentivize your employees. They're rewards given to employees with the aim of motivating them and retaining them within the organisation. So you might think that salary alone is a lot enough to do that, but we're seeing a lot of employees and individuals now looking beyond the numbers and looking for a bit more from their employers, not necessarily in a financial sense, but there can be culture pieces that are part of that as well. So we'll go through today some sort of standard incentives that you might automatically think of, and then also some wider incentives as well that you might not have. Incentives obviously are good for, as we said, the retention of your current team, but they're also quite a genuine way to build a business. So if your employees love where they work, they're going to talk positively about you when they're talking to other people. They're going to talk positively about you if other people are looking for a job with you. So it's a real benefit for the culture of the organisation and also from a business perspective as well. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Jack. So on the slide here, we've got what I would say are probably the most obvious employee incentives, and you might already have thought of these either in your own organisation or by virtue of having been employed somewhere else. But obviously what's possible in terms of incentivising employees will vary substantially between businesses depending on their size and their resources and things. So we'll do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through these. And then we can also come on to consider some non-financial incentives, because the ones that are on the screen there are mainly financial. So first one is pensions. As an employment lawyer, I'll do the disclaimer first. I can't give you any advice about pensions or any tax advice. It's purely from an employment law perspective and how a pension might be a benefit to an employee. So you might already know that employers have to provide a workplace pension for workers who meet certain thresholds unless they decide to opt out. So the standard minimum contributions that an employer must make are 3% for the employer, and they need to deduct 5% for an employee, so an 8% total contribution. The obvious incentive there that you might have is whether you can consider if you can increase those contributions to an employee's pension. So can you match their 5% and make it a 10% overall contribution, or can you go above and beyond that? The other thing to consider, which might be a benefit to your employees, how you deduct that pension. So if you do that via salary sacrifice, that will reduce their tax and national insurance liability and increase their overall take-home pay, and they're also getting the benefit, obviously, of the money going into their pension. Other thing to think about in the sphere of pensions is what other incentives your pension provider offers. So sometimes they can explore whether they are able to offer you and whether it's financially viable to offer you health insurance for your employees, or also death in service benefits. So if an employee was to pass away, they might be entitled to a certain amount of their salary, or their family would be entitled to that. So worth having a look into beyond the pension, what your pension provider can offer you. Next one there is a company car. So this won't be feasible for everybody, but if you run a business where a car is an integral part of that, that's obviously a benefit to an employee if they're provided that through the organisation. If a car is not feasible, you might think about a car allowance, so a certain amount of money per month or per year that an employee can put towards a car. An obvious benefit for them, and it also might be beneficial for you depending on the work that's being done. The one thing I would say about that is does have tax implications. So you would need to make sure your employees are comfortable with the tax position and they're not getting a sort of unexpected tax liability, and also that you, from a business perspective, are happy with how that operates. The next one there is health and wellness. So this is rightly a bit of a hot topic at the moment. And again, there will be levels to this depending on what kind of business you're in and where your sort of financial resources are. Some employers have quite a comprehensive private healthcare scheme or dental insurance, employee support systems, mental health, access to mental health services and things like that. But it doesn't need to be as extensive as that. You could think about things like whether you can offer a cycle to work scheme, discounted gym memberships, subsidised meals at work, financial wellbeing workshops, stress management workshops, things like that. And that's particularly useful if, for example, you work to the financial year. So after financial year end, you might think about, oh, well, people might be a bit stressed. Maybe we should implement a stress workshop every year at that point in time. So aim of the health and wellness benefits is obviously to make sure that your workforce are well looked after and that they feel well looked after as well. Obvious benefit to the business of that is reduced stress of the workforce, less likelihood of people going off ill or being absent for long periods of time. And it's also a bit of a morale boost and a bit of a productivity boost as well if people feel like they're well looked after. From an employment law perspective, to ensure flexibility and that you can increase or decrease or remove levels of benefits that you give in this sphere, we would always recommend they're positioned as discretionary benefits rather than contractual. If it's in a contract, for example, then it makes it a bit more difficult if something's not working well or if it's not viable for you anymore to provide that. If circumstances changed, it makes it a bit more difficult for you to amend that or to remove that benefit, and that can lead to claims by employees about, that's in my contract, so you removing that benefit from me would be a breach of my contract. So we would always recommend they're positioned as discretionary, just so you've got that flexibility there as well. The next thing on the screen there is bonus schemes. So this is probably the first thing that pops into most people's head as a benefit beyond their standard package. Of course, that's really useful to motivate employees if it's linked to targets, and that's also useful for you if it is, because you're generating more fees, you're generating more business because employees are trying to reach these targets. But it doesn't necessarily need to be linked to financial metrics. It could be linked to positive feedback that they receive, or recognition, or them reaching a qualification or something like that. Again, from an employment law perspective, it's useful to have that mapped out in quite a detailed way in a contract or a policy, and again, described as discretionary, because you don't want to get into the position where you're not in a position to offer a bonus for one reason or another, and the employees are saying, well, it needs to be because that's what's in my contract. So you can also implement a discretionary element in terms of, okay, well, the target's not been fully met, but maybe we'll pay out 50% because you met 50% of the target or something like that. So it doesn't need to be a negative that you're always taking away. It can be that you're implementing a bit of flexibility and still making the best of something if a target hasn't been met. Bonuses as well can be sort of annual bonuses. Again, you would want to make sure that's discretionary in case circumstances change, but some places offer Christmas bonuses, things like that. We're seeing less of that now, but it's still a possibility. Next thing there on the slide is holidays. So holidays are another area like pensions where you can consider an increase from the statutory minimums as a bit of a benefit. So the statutory position is that full-time employees are entitled to 5.6 weeks holiday per year. So that works out about 28 days. So you might want to offer just a blanket increase to 30 days, for example, or if somebody's been with you a year, they get another day of holiday. And that's an incentive to obviously to stay with the organisation for longer. Some employers, a bit rare, some employers have no limit on their holidays. unlimited paid time off, but it's a bit less common to see that. It tends to be, the sort of big American businesses that boast about that. If you were to implement something like that, you'd need to be really careful around, management of the business's needs and making sure that some people weren't taking lots of holiday and other people weren't taking any at all. In the same vein as that, in terms of holiday, you could consider having some kind of career break or sabbatical policy with the intention that you're giving people time off space to go and do that, with the intention that they then come back to the business. If structured days off or extra holidays aren't feasible, you can have a think about things like an early finish on your birthday, a wellness hour every week, qualification leave, again, if it comes back to the training courses and reaching a certain milestone. Things like that can be quite useful incentives as well. Bringing us on to training courses, that's not on the slides, but that's another mutual benefit there. So they can be quite expensive, but you will be getting the value of somebody having upskilled their experience, their skills, their knowledge. It's valuable for the business, but it's also very valuable for the individual as well. Like I said, there can be a significant cost to that, so you can think about incorporating some kind of training recoupment clause into your contracts. They need to stay for a certain amount of time after they've done a qualification or meta qualification, and if they don't, there can be a sort of graded payback of the training costs that you've incurred. Do need to be really careful about how that's done, because it can be sometimes considered an unlawful penalty, but something to consider if training would be valuable for your organisation and for your employees. So we'll move on to non-financial incentives now. The first part of that is something that's quite easy in a way to implement. It's just your culture and your policy pieces. So you don't need to have most employment policies. There's some that are required, and we recommend certain key policies, but one benefit that having policies does bring you is the ability to shape what kind of culture you want and what kind of culture your employees are working within and that you want to promote. So if employees know that they have a bank of policies that align with their values and they provide them with benefits and flexibility, they're going to feel valued and they're going to feel looked after. From your perspective, well-documented policies set expectations and they give you guidance on how to proceed if something happens. So if an employee goes off on maternity leave, or if they experience a bereavement, or if they're off sick, you've got a process already there, and everybody is on the same page about how that's going to be managed. Most policies aren't contractual, and again, we come back to the discretionary piece here. You want to have flexibility to change things if they're not going well, or if they could be working better. So we would always recommend that if you do have policies, they're framed as specifically being not contractual. You can again think about enhancing policies, so enhancing the standard maternity position, enhancing the standard paternity position, either in terms of offering more than the statutory pay would be, or more than the statutory time limits would be. And again, the workplace culture piece is the main part of that. If employees feel valued, then, and they know that you're backing them in terms of what they've got to fall back on, then the culture and the work ethic is going to be better. In terms of other non-financial incentives, benefits, like we said, they don't have to be financial, and often culture benefits can improve retention just as much as financial benefits. There's always going to be an employer that's willing to pay more money, but if your employees are happy and if they're content in the team that they're working with and they love what they're doing, then they're less likely to consider that. They're less likely to be looking elsewhere. So we've talked about formal training and paying for training, but you can also consider informal mentorship and development opportunities. Is there somebody within your organisation that has a particular skill set that would be happy to pass that on informally? Feedback mechanisms are also another really important piece. There was a recent CIPD study, I think, that said that more than 70% of employees said their relationship with their direct manager had a direct impact on their engagement and their motivation at work. And there's loads and loads of research that's been done into people feeling like their work is meaningful and how important that is above everything else. So if you're doing weekly check-ins, making sure people are okay, that's good in terms of the employee feeling supported and knowing they've got somebody to go to, but it's also good from your perspective because you can spot things like burnout or stress, or if somebody's not happy and what you can do to fix that. So the feedback mechanisms tend to be really popular and really valuable, and it's a really easy way to keep engagement up with your employees. Also, more popular incentives, some of these might not be feasible, but things like bring your dog to work day or bake sales, charity incentives, even simple things like if you're in a small team, can you have a breakfast meeting once a week and maybe somebody brings pastries and coffees in and it's just a chance to catch up with everybody. It doesn't need to be anything groundbreaking on the non-financial incentives. Similarly, if you've got good relationships with other businesses, can you do a mutual discount scheme for their products? Can you offer tickets to things, benefits for retailers or things like that? You can be quite flexible and quite innovative with the non-financial benefits. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Jack, I think that should be flexible working. So flexible working can be two things. So it can refer to a flexible working request under the statutory scheme, or it can be a sort of general flexibility in how people work. Either definition, the purpose of flexible working is to benefit the employee in terms of their work-life balance and their home life and their commitments outside of work. So the statutory scheme, the detail of making a flexible working request is beyond the scope of this workshop. It's really quite detailed, but broadly, an employee has a right to make a flexible working request, and that can be flexibility in terms of changing their hours, changing the days that they work, changing their contract basically so that their working hours that are stated in there are then differed. So there's specific things that an employer needs to do when they consider that request, and they need to do that within certain timescales. So if you've got any specific concerns about that, we would always recommend taking advice. But the general position is an employee has a right to make this request. It's not a right to flexible working. It can be rejected in certain circumstances, but there's certain things you need to do if you get a formal flexible working request. Outside of the statutory scheme, you're perfectly entitled to implement whatever flexibility that you want into your working arrangements. So you can have a general approach to flexible working, so hybrid working some of the week, all remote working with certain anchor days where everybody's in the office, or a set number of days in the office for everybody, but you don't need to be in on the same days. You could do completely remote working, so from home the whole time, or some places have a complete flexibility or a work from anywhere policy. Obviously, from our perspective, advising employers, we would be a bit wary about that one, and there can be tax implications if people work abroad at the pool or something like that for a certain amount of time. But it's really depending on what works best for your organisation. Again, we come back to the discretionary piece. If you do allow hybrid or home working, we would always recommend that that's documented in a policy, just so that you have flexibility. If it's not working well, you can go in and inspect documents or inspect home working equipment and things like that if you've got any concerns, or if it's not working at all, that you can revoke the ability to work from home or require more days in the office. So again, the discretionary piece is the most important part on that. In terms of what else you can do to offer flexibility, a lot of the time flexible working requests and general flexible working, that comes from a need for flexibility around external commitments. So your employees might have family obligations or caring obligations, and that's why they need this additional flexibility from you. If that's the case and it's happening quite often, you might want to think about what additional enhancements and flexibility that you can offer, and that might be things like tailoring family-friendly policies, so your maternity, paternity, bereavement policies and things like that. And again, that ties back in with what we said earlier about the policies and promoting a good culture, making sure people feel looked after and they feel valued. So if we can go on to the next slides, please, Jack. And that is just a slide that asks what works best. You might have gathered that you don't need to move mountains with this. What works best for you will be different from what works best for another employer and another set of employees. So the thing that we always say is to speak to your workforce regularly, ask what you're doing well, ask what you could be doing better, ask for suggestions. If you can implement those suggestions, great, do that. If you can't, have a think about why not and explain that to the workforce. Just make sure that you're regularly checking in. What could you do instead of their suggestions? What's not working? A workforce that feels listened to and feels valued, and sees the implementation of their suggestions, or at least sees that you're taking them seriously and you're considering them, they're much more likely to feel valued and to want to stay and work through any improvements, than if you just went off on your own and thought, well, I think this is best for the organisation. So it's really important. I think the main thing is to check in with your employees and make sure that everything's aligned, and you're on the same page. So that would be what works best from our perspective. And I think that's me at the end of my slide, so I'll pass over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Claire. So yeah, next slide. Thanks, Jack. So another way to incentivize your employees would be through share options. So share options give a third party, such as an employee or a director known as an option holder, a right to acquire shares in the company at an agreed price at some point in the future, and that can be subject to certain criteria being met or certain events occurring. And this is different to when someone has just issued shares in the company. So the key difference being that with an option, it's only at the point that the option becomes exercisable that that option holder can acquire those shares and become a shareholder in the company. Whereas just issuing shares to someone will give that holder the direct and immediate ownership of those shares in the company and all the associated rights that come with it. So just looking at some comparisons between the two in terms of voting rights and dividends, share options don't provide those until they're exercised, whereas shares might, depending on the rights attached to them. In terms of dilution, share options won't immediately dilute existing shareholders, but just issuing shares will. The terms of share options are governed until they're exercised by the option agreement, whereas share ownership is governed immediately by the company's articles and any shareholders agreements that are in place. So Jack, if you could just go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So why would companies use share options? They can be a really valuable tool for smaller companies, and the reason for using them are typically financial and motivational because they're a way of incentivizing your staff for less cost. So on the screen there are some examples of the benefits of share options. So the first one is recruitment. So you can use share options to attract skilled employees because it gives companies the ability to offer competitive pay packages without having the cost of a high salary. And this is particularly beneficial in scale up and high growth companies because it allows you to offer share options to supplement those lower salaries, and the cost saving, and that can go somewhere else where it might be more needed in the business at the time. In terms of retention, share options can encourage loyalty and incentivize employees to stay with the company as it grows. So under the terms of a share option, employees are often required to stay with the company to earn the shares, with provisions for the option to lapse and not become exercisable if they leave before a certain amount of time or before the company's exit. In terms of incentivisation, the options to get the shares in the company can help motivate employees work towards increasing the company's value because their reward ultimately will depend on the company's success because they'll benefit from the share price growth and a high valuation on exit. It could also help motivate employees to reach their own specific goals because options can be made specific, subject to specific performance targets, and where that's the case, employees will be more incentivized to meet those targets if it means that they get an option for shares in the company. In terms of alignment, share options can help align employees' interests with shareholders' interests, and it can help promote the long-term goals of the company over short-term gains, and it assures the shareholders that the key employees have a vested interest in the company's success. And then in terms of rewards, share options are beneficial for the company because they provide a way to reward employees without using cash. And the option holder is rewarded by being offered the potential for significant gains from company growth and sale. And they could also be structured to provide tax advantages for both the company and the employees. And we'll touch on that a bit later when we come to look at the different types of options. Jack, if you could go on to the next slide, please. Thanks. So when it comes to implementing share options, you would first consider your option pool, and then it would be implemented through option rules and option agreements where you consider the various terms such as performance criteria, investing, and when the option becomes exercisable. And then your option will be granted, and eventually, once vested, it becomes exercisable, and at that point, the option holder gets their shares. So just looking firstly at the option pool, if you do decide to give employees options, you would need to consider how many shares you want to grant options over. So this will be your option pool, and it's a percentage of your share capital that's reserved for option holders. This is an important decision because it will affect the dilution of the existing shareholders in the company. And you'll also need to consider any future investment that you plan to raise, because future investors might not like it if the share option is over a large percentage of the share cap table. Another point to consider is that whilst the share capital can look completely different to when the option is granted compared to when it's exercised. So when you're considering your option pool, you'll consider the percentage of the options, whereas when you're considering giving individual employees options, you'll consider that over a number of shares, and that prevents you on exit having to give away more equity than was intended at the outset, because equity in every company is precious, and once you give it away, it can be difficult to get it back. So it's important to consider an appropriate level of options before you go out and start having any discussions with your employees and putting any options in place. So in terms of implementing, when we put in place documents, there's two different ways that we can document it. So if the intention is only to give an option to one or two employees, we might just have a single option agreement which contains all the terms for each option holder. Or alternatively, we can have a share option scheme. So if this is something that you plan to put in place for a larger number of employees, in that case, we'd have a set of rules which sets out how the option can be exercised, when it lapses, and the terms of it. And then each option holder would just have a short form option agreement which applies those rules and sets out the number of shares and any vesting or performance criteria specific to that individual. So that approach makes it easier to roll out for employees going forward as the company grows. One important point to note is that a common problem that we see is the use of online templates for option agreements and rules, particularly when it comes to EMIs. We'll cover EMIs in the next slides, but using online templates for an EMI can be risky because they're tax advantaged options and there's strict legislation around that. So it's important that you get that right. So whilst using online templates will be cheaper, we've seen issues with EMIs not being done properly. And when it comes to an exit and the option holders are trying to exercise, it can cause a lot of problems. So if an EMI isn't done properly, you won't get the tax benefits that come with it. And there's little point in doing it if you don't get those tax benefits. So looking at vesting and performance criteria, as I mentioned before, the company can make the option subject to certain things happening or certain targets being met, which helps incentivise employees, and this is at the discretion of the company. So some examples are, you might have an option that vests over time, so after a year they get 10 shares, after 2 years they get 20 shares, and so on. So that employee is incentivised to stay with the company for a certain number of years before they get their full option. You could also have an option subject to certain milestones or performance criteria. For example, if the company hits £100,000 revenue in year one, they get 10 shares, 150,000 in year two, they get another 10, and so on. So performance criteria can be flexible to suit the company. So it could be based on sales, revenue, reaching certain milestones in product development, or even the company getting a certain valuation on exit, which is one that we've seen just recently. And then when it comes to exercising, one important distinction to make is the difference between the option vesting and the option being exercised. So whilst hitting those certain performance criteria or vesting criteria essentially secures the option for the the shares for the option holder, they don't actually become a shareholder until they exercise. Again, the company can be flexible on when the option can be exercised. It's entirely at the company's discretion. So it might be that they become exercisable immediately once they're vested, or what's more common is that they're ex only, which means that they can only be exercised when the company is sold. And in that case, the option holder will become a shareholder kind of immediately before the company's then sold on. So a key point to note is that on exercise, the option holder actually has to purchase the shares before they become a shareholder. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the exercise price will be determined when the option is granted. So assuming that the shares go up in value, they'll be discounted compared to what they would be purchasing them at market value at the time that they're exercised. So bearing this point in mind, one of the benefits of an exit only option for the option holder is that they might not have, that spare chunk of money sitting to actually purchase the shares. So if it's exit only, we can provide for a cashless exercise on exit, which means that because the option holder exercises their option when the company's sold and sells their shares at the same time, we can include a mechanism where the exercise price that they would have to pay for the shares is just deducted from the sale proceeds, and they would get what's left. So they're still getting their proceeds on sale without having to find the money to actually purchase the shares. And the X only option is also really good for the company because it prevents option holders being on the cap table throughout the growth of the business, because having a crowded cap table could be problematic. So it's easier if the option holders are all exercised on exit. So Jack, if you go on to the next slide, please, we'll have a look at the different types of share options. So they broadly fall into two categories of approved and unapproved. And the biggest difference between the two is the tax treatment. So tax favourable or approved options usually come in the form of an EMI, which is an employee management incentive. So for an option to qualify as an EMI, there's several eligibility criteria that must be satisfied, and there's some types of businesses that don't qualify for an EMI, such as farming or property development companies, and the legislation sets out specific qualifying criteria. Some examples of these are that the option holder must be an employee. There's also the working time requirement, which is that the option holder must be employed for at least 25 hours a week, or if they're employed for less than that, 75% of their working time. The option holder can, either alone or together with a connected party, control more than 30% of the company. The company must also employ less than 250 full-time employees. It must have a permanent UK establishment and have assets of 30 million or less. And the company must also be independent, so it can't be a subsidiary of another company or under the control of another company. So EMIs are primarily used for tax efficiency, and it's important that you get tax advice on them to ensure that the EMI scheme is adopted and maintained correctly. We can help put an EMI scheme in place and draft the legal documentation, but we don't offer any tax advice, so we would work closely with your accountant or tax advisor on it. You need to get an HMRC valuation on the company for an EMI, and there's ongoing reporting requirements to HMRC when the option is granted and then annually thereafter. You can still be flexible when it comes to performance criteria and exercising, but compared to an unapproved option, EMIs are more strict because of the legislation, and it can be more expensive to implement them, but the tax savings can be significant. So most startups and SMEs will choose an EMI if they are eligible. So lastly, just looking at the unapproved option, if you don't qualify for an EMI, you can then use an unapproved option, and that's essentially an option that doesn't have any favourable tax treatment. So these are a lot less restrictive in terms of eligibility and qualifying criteria because there's not a strict statutory regime like the EMI legislation, and they're less strict on who they can be given to. So these could be used to grant options to directors, consultants, or employees who don't meet the working time requirements for an EMI. They don't, as I said, they don't get the favourable tax treatment like an EMI would, but they are cheaper and easier to implement. So I think that's the last slide there, Jack, if you could pop on to the next one. Yeah, so that was everything I had to cover on share options. So we can open up now to a Q&A. I don't know if there's been any questions in the chat as we've been going through, or if anyone has anything they'd like to ask just now.
Hi, Auntie. That was great. Thank you very much for that. So we've had one question in the chat. Sorry, two questions now. But if anyone after this wants to turn on their mics and ask a question, that's fine too. So however you want to work it. So from Anton, could you please clarify what discretionary benefits are and how to make sure they are properly highlighted as discretionary?
Yeah, of course. So anything that you want to offer as a benefit, you could frame it as discretionary, and most of the time we would recommend that that is done. So a good example might be, we talked about the Christmas bonus. So instead of having in your contract, you will get a £500 bonus at Christmas, that would then be a contractual entitlement. So every Christmas, no matter the performance of the company, no matter the circumstances, that employee has a contractual entitlement to £500 of a bonus at Christmas time. But instead of framing it like that, if you wanted to make it discretionary, you could say at the discretion of the company, or depending on performance targets, you will get a £500 bonus at Christmas time. Entitlement to that bonus in 1 year doesn't necessarily convey an entitlement to it in the next year. So it's just adding in that element of flexibility that allows you to consider on a case by case basis whether that's something that's feasible for you, and that applies to your policies as well. So this policy is non-contractual, we might amend it at any time. You're not tying yourself into getting into a breach of contract situation there, because if you just had the you'll get a £500 bonus at Christmas and it's not paid, then that exposes you to breach of contract claims if you didn't pay it and an employee kicked up a fuss about that. So it's just giving you extra flexibility there and making clear that you do have that flexibility to change things if you need to.
Claire, thank you so much for this. Just to double check, it's still written in the actual contract. The key is that how it is written.
Yeah, well, you can have things that are in the contract. So if you, for your home working policies and things like that, you can have a piece on that in the contract, and you can say we might withdraw this scheme at any time. It's at our discretion to allow you to work from home. But you might also have a separate working from home policy, which is non-contractual, which is more detailed. But again, you've got the right to change all of the aspects of that because it's non-contractual, and you've said you might amend it at any time. So some things might be in the contract and they're stated as discretionary. The important part is that you have that discretionary wording in there so that doesn't then become a contractual entitlement for the employee.
And how would you recommend structuring it in terms of, would you normally include that into the actual contract, or would you include in the contract that there are policies regarding something, and then there would be a separate file with the policies listed that are not
Yeah,
contractual?
yeah. So if you were doing best practice and you were doing it comprehensively, you would have your contract. And if you had home working, for example, you might say you are entitled to work on a hybrid basis. This is at our discretion. We might amend it any time. Please refer to the terms of our home working policy, and it refers you externally. So that would be
Thank you
the
so much.
ideal situation.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you both. So Anton, we'll come back to you. I think you've got another question there, but we'll go to John first, if that's okay.
Hi, Claire. Thanks very much. That's been really helpful so far. Just a question. What happens if you award share options to somebody in your company because they've helped you a lot along your journey, and then they leave by mutual agreement, but you still want them to retain those for when you do exit? Because normally it's written that if they leave the company, they lose the share options. Is there any way to overcome that?
Might be one for Erin in combination. Normally when we're advising on that, we would advise you take separate advice on that because it will depend on the terms of the share scheme. You can try and come to separate arrangements, but I don't know, Erin, if you've got any input on if you've seen anything like that.
Sorry, John, would you just mind repeating that? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem at all. So if you've awarded share options under EMI scheme to somebody in your company because they've helped you along the way or given up a lot of time for free and you want to reward them, and then by mutual agreement you agree that they will leave your company, is there a way of them still retaining those share options? Because normally they would be cancelled upon somebody, leaving the company.
Yeah, it would just depend on what we've got in the agreement. So we would have in the agreement certain, circumstances where the option would lapse. So we can just draft that kind of accordingly. So if they left and you didn't want the option to lapse, then it can just keep going.
Okay.
And they can exercise it.
Just to jump in on that, right? What you do need to factor in though on this, and it wouldn't be uncommon, as Erin says, for an agreement to turn around and say, if you leave, it lapses unless the board decide otherwise.
Yeah, okay.
So that's quite common type of provisions. There's two things you need to watch in this. Use of discretion in EMIs can be a tax problem. So before you do exercise any form of discretion under an EMI, you need to make sure you get tax advice on it. And over and above that, if somebody is no longer an employee, as a matter of fact, they are no longer a qualifying employee, like Erin was explaining, because they no longer meet the working time requirements. So as a result of that, when they cease to be an employee, unless they exercise that option within a period of 90 days from they leave, it's no longer going to get the beneficial tax treatment. So your options then are allow them to exercise in 90 days so they can keep the tax treatment, or let them keep the option, but they can exercise at exit, but they don't have the tax treatment on it.
Yeah, okay.
Now, one is clearly better for them to get the better tax treatment if they exercise in 90 days. So that's better for the option holder. The quid pro quo is that's not as ideal for the company, because rather than being an option holder, that person then becomes an actual shareholder.
Yeah.
So if you did that, you've then got a whole bucket load of other things you then need to think about, because, well, what happens now and how am I going to regulate the relationship as a shareholder? So I suppose the short version is it is all doable, but there's, depending what way you go, there's ramifications that just need thought through. So if you do want to do something like that, it's key, make sure you get proper advice at the time when your EMI is put in place. And then as you go along, when events happen, come back and get further advice on it so you can keep yourself straight.
Yeah. No, really helpful. Thank you, Joe. And good to see you again after about a decade.
Obviously not looking one bit older.
Can I double check on the same topic just to make sure I understand it correctly? Does that mean, so if you have employees and you've set up this EMI scheme and they worked enough to get those options, so let's say they have been vested, and then the employee leaves, and then the company only gets sold, 5 years down the line, that person is no longer eligible for the tax benefit under EMI because they're no longer an employee at the time of sale.
Yeah, it's exactly the same point. Whether they vested or how it's all worked, it's exactly the same point applies. Now, if somebody's got vested shares, and I think this is where a lot of the complications with the EMIs come in, because people think, oh, if it's vested, it's fine. But the underlying point remains the same. If you leave, you either exercise within 90 days or you lose the tax treatment. Okay. So a lot of companies are a lot of founders are very keen on the concept of having it vested. The difficulty comes, and so you're going to issue EMIs, fine. It's unlikely everyone who you issue these EMIs to are going to stay the full journey with you. So when you unravel the EMI, that's when it gets more difficult. They're going to exercise, great, because they're leaving. There comes the next problem. These shares need paid for. On exercise, you pay for them. So do they have the money to pay for them? And there is just things to think through in this. So when you design your EMI, and a lot of companies I have seen have put in really convoluted, complicated things about how all this vesting is going to work. But the bottom line always comes back to remain the same. If they leave, they either exercise to keep the tax treatment, or if they don't exercise, they lose the tax treatment.
But they still keep the options and they could benefit from them later.
If they're vested. But
yeah.
It depends how you want to work. It depends how you want to work it through, and different founders have got different views on this. I think when we're hearing Claire speak, so no doubt some of you were thinking when Claire was speaking about all the benefits we can give employees. Some of you going, great, I really want to implement that stuff. That's great, because some people are more employee friendly than others, and it's exactly the same way with options. Different founders have got different views about how employee friendly they want to be. So
okay, and
that's why I kind of just think to give all of these kind of all these things kind of quite careful thought before you implement it.
Since I have this opportunity, let's say someone works for 3 years and then they're no longer employed and they've got the EMI shares, then they're hired again, work for another 2 months, and then the company gets sold. Do they get the benefit of tax or not?
Sorry, so they work for 3 years and then leave.
Then they leave for, let's say, for 2 years. Then they hired again for 2 months, and after those 2 months, while they're still employee, the company gets sold.
We need to get specialist tax input on that one, but I suspect my guess is they would not. My guess is they lose the tax. My guess is they lose the tax. My suspicion is they would lose the tax. They'd lose the tax treat because the disqualifying event happened.
Perfect. Thank you. I won't stop bugging you.
So I have a question, Erin, which is around, you did touch on this actually, but I had heard of someone who had put their own scheme together using templates and then ran into problems with that. So can you explain the types of issues that you can get into if you do that? I think it was around not having the right permissions around tax.
Yeah, it's usually around the tax. So if the EMI isn't done properly, if the documentation doesn't reflect the right legislation, then they won't get the favourable tax treatment. So it's a bit like we were saying earlier, they'll still get the option, but it won't be as tax favourable.
Yeah, so that's why it's important to take advice around that and make sure that you've got all of that up to date.
Yeah. See, just add into that, one of the issues that companies will quite often do, so there's 2 key things with an EMI. You need to get the valuation agreed with HMRC, and then you need to have the proper documents round about it. Now, if you go and do a Mickey Mouse valuation, because you're thinking, oh, great, that's going to give me the option holders a lesser value, and there is no shortage of online platforms who will give you Mickey Mouse valuations.
Yeah.
You're going to come unstuck. You may as well not bothered with it, because when it comes to exercise, HM are just going to go, you're at it. No.
Oh, right. Okay.
Other issue you've got is a lot of the online platforms, and just to be really clear on it, these online platforms will do them at a fraction of what the cost of a law firm or an accountancy firm will do it. It will be significantly cheaper. What they'll do often is they'll create a scheme that is wildly convoluted, that nobody has a clue what it means. And my general take on it is, if nobody understands it, it's pointless.
Yeah.
And it'll create a whole load of classes of shares in the scheme. So they'll issue, for example, you'll have option shares over B shares, and the B shares don't even exist. So we'll quite often get instructed by companies who'll come to us and say, I've done this on Seed Legals, for example, it's one of the platforms.
Yeah.
But I've got problems now. And then we need to go and try and start fixing it.
Yeah, so then they end up incurring a lot of costs trying to fix the issues that they could have avoided in the first place.
Correct. And we've also had issues. So when people go to sell their business, what we've seen as well is the issues with the EMI haven't been picked up earlier on, and we've just maybe acted on the exit on it. And what happens then is the buyer looks at it and goes, you've made a mess of your EMI. So there's now tax liabilities on all of this. Therefore, the tax liability is going to be £200,000. So do you know what then happens then? Founder, that's £200,000 less you are getting.
Yeah.
Because so it's at that point in time, at the exit, because that exit, the person who fundamentally pays for a mistake as the founder because the price reduces that you're going to get.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So I had one other question just quickly, Claire, which was obviously a lot of talk, so many different incentives. What are the most popular ones you see? Because you gave us a list of a number of different ones.
It really depends on the business. That's what's quite nice about it, is you can adjust it to what's important to you, what's important to your employees. The bonus is probably the most common that we see, and it doesn't need to be anything astronomical. If you've got a business that's quite driven by financial metrics, it can be really useful as an incentive for people. Benefits the business because you're hitting your targets that you need to hit, and it benefits the employee because they're getting something out of it as well. But I think the thing that people tend to see as most valuable, and it is because there's a push towards the work-life balance, which there should be, it's the flexible working and the home working, and then tied into that additional holidays and a bit of sort of give and take around holidays and days off. So those are probably the most popular ones that we see, but you can be very flexible with what you're
I mean,
offering.
we just agreed everybody gets their birthday off at Edge this year.
Yeah, so quite a nice one.
Quite
that
popular.
One.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay,
See, just a thought on this, which we've seen recently, which has been when we were actually on an exit, which was an issue, is so we were selling a Scottish company to a US buyer, and the way that employees are treated in the US is really different from how employees are treated in the UK. So the Scottish target had 4-day weeks, incentives, they had all sorts of things going on, and it was a really employee friendly organization. The problem is from the buyer's issue, though, is how are they going to integrate this into the wider group? How is it going to work when the guys in the US are working 5 days a week and getting paid for 5 days a week? How are they going to feel about their Scottish colleagues working 4 days a week and getting paid for 5?
Yeah,
so that's quite an interesting thing, because perhaps if you are targeting an American exit, then you would need to consider that in your company culture as you go along.
100%, Evelyn. If you're looking, if you think you are going to be going for, you think your exit could be a US buyer, consider just at the outset that the buyer's going to have to amalgamate in this team. So how does that work through?
I think Claire's advice around making sure that you don't put lots of things in the contract and that you're able to withdraw them is probably very helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's something people need to be thinking about a lot more. We're even seeing it already with big businesses. So Lidl, I think, was one of the examples with Trump's rollback of all the DEI initiatives. Businesses who are headquartered in the US or have big outfits in the US, their British entities, their UK entities are starting to roll back on all their DEI initiatives as well. So that is something to consider. If you're putting a lot of effort into your culture, and then that's what your end target is, that might not be something that's going to be able to continue through. So I think we'll see a lot more of that.
Yep. Yeah, so it's that whole thinking ahead piece. Yeah, that's interesting.
The only other thought I'd have on this is that when it comes exit, you may well just take the view of, if they're not going to be nice to my employees, it's not the right buyer. And we've acted just quite recently. We concluded a deal, and it was nearly off because the seller didn't like the buyer, and there will be many people who simply do not sell to people they don't like the look of for whatever reason. So it may well be you take the view of, look, you know what, I don't care if this takes me out of the US market, because fundamentally I'm people first, and I'm not going to rest in my laurels or due to the fact of that might mean I get slightly less at exit. So I'm not saying you have to do it. I'm just saying that there's.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that would probably be, if you've built up a great business with a great team, you might not want to do that to your team. So I'm conscious of time though, and your time as well. Does anyone get any other questions before we say a huge thank you to Claire, Erin, and Joe at Harper Macleod? Oh, just some thank yous coming in. So, yeah, thank you so much. That was really helpful, and I certainly learned quite a few things that I didn't know, and I hope that everyone else on the call did. But I think probably the key thing that we would leave you with is take advice, when you're doing these things. And, I know that Harper Macleod would be delighted to chat to you about any questions you might have personally in your business. Okay, so thank you. Thanks, Claire, Erin and Joe, and enjoy the sunshine before the rain starts on Sunday.
Super,
Thanks,
lovely
everyone.
to see
Thank-
you all.
thank
Enjoy
you.
the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.